Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Kat Rambo. Today, Kat will be sharing a talk on world building so you can create a world that pulls the reader in and makes them feel as though they are living the story. This talk is part of our monthly lecture series where we host talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. Kat Rambo is the Nebula Award-winning author of science fiction and fantasy. Their sci-fi series, You Sexy Thing, was published by Tor Macmillan. The series is the Disco Space Opera, and the book that I read recently, You Sexy Thing, was published by Tor Macmillan. Kat has been published in Asimov's, Clark's World, and Tor.com, among many other places. Kat was also a two-term president of the SFWA. Last year, I read Kat Rambo's two books in the space opera series, the Disco Space Opera series, and I thoroughly enjoyed them. And so that is part of why I asked Kat to talk with us today. And I'm really excited by what hearing from Kat and what they may have to say. So I'm grateful for you for being here today, Kat. Thank you and welcome. How are you?
I am delightful, and it is so much fun. I was watching all the locations scroll past, and that is just, I think this is one of the kind of crazy cool things about the internet, is being able to connect so many people.
Yeah, we are. We have such an international audience. It's wonderful. I'm always amazed at how we can bring people together from around the world. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say today. So whenever you're ready, let's go into it.
Well, I will launch into it. And this is a version of a kind of longer class that I do sometimes that stretches out to hour and a half, 2 hours. So we're going to go at a madcap pace. And I'm glad that we're recording, but we also get a chance at the end to ask questions if anything I say isn't clear. So let's talk about how do we build immersive worlds as writers. And as readers, we love the books that take us away from ourselves. We love the books that let us live out another life, another existence, and forget for a while this one. And a good book is one where the reader can forget that they're reading because they feel like they're really there. They're breathing the same air as the characters and experiencing the world almost as though they're dreaming it. And so how do you, as a writer, create a world that pulls in a reader? And how do you avoid the mistakes that remind the reader that they're reading and throw them out of the story? Because that's one of the worst things you can do as a writer, is most of the time remind the reader that they're reading. So I'm going to give you some tools, kind of grouped into little groups, and some techniques. And with each, I'm also going to give you some writing exercises that I'll basically talk through, but I'm also going to give Jacob a copy of them. So you don't need to worry about writing them down. You can get the copy from him afterwards. And when you do the exercises, the way that I do them often is with timed writings. And for me, that's a pretty crucial part of my writing practice. I sit down and I just keep writing and I don't edit, and I go for a certain amount of time. And so in classes, I usually do the exercises for 5 to 10 minutes per exercise. But since you're going to be doing them at home, feel free to do them as long as you like. And don't be worried about doing them, wrong. They're writing exercises. If you're putting words on the page, then you are doing them correctly. So the first set of tools, and one of the most important for building immersive worlds, are the senses. And golden age science fiction, which is kind of the late 1930s to the 1950s, when science fiction was kind of first coming into its own as a genre, one of their rules of writers was to invoke all 5 senses within the first page of a story. And it turns out there's actually some science behind that method, because the writing that uses the senses creates more brain activity. and it sets off mirror neurons. And mirror neurons are neurons that fire under, they basically mimic what would be happening if neurons were firing, as though you were experiencing an event. And so writing that invokes the senses makes mirror neurons fire, and that makes your reader feel as though they're experiencing what you're describing. And so that's great advice to use the senses, but I think you also want to prioritize them, because we get kind of inured to sight and sound by watching television or going to the movies. And if you go further than sight and sound, and if you push into smell and taste, and most importantly, touch, you're going to be taking advantage of one of the things that fiction can do that television and movies can't, at least yet so far. I know smell-o-vision's been tried, but unsuccessfully. But touch, right, is the most, of all of those, it's the most important. And that's because touch is more than a question of just smooth versus rough or velvet versus pebbled. It is a category that includes temperature, like the chilly breeze or the warmth of a sunbeam. It includes bodily sensations like pain, nausea, exhaustion, fever, itches. And it includes motion words like falling, flying, floating. And when you use these feelings that are centered in the body, in your writing, you're making the reader feel as though they're in the body of the point of view character, and as though they are experiencing the story world through them. And this is a key technique when writing an immersive world. So one of the exercises that I think is really, really handy to do is take a page or two from one of your stories and use 5 colors of highlighters to go through marking the sensory stuff. Now, of course, assign 1 color to each of the senses. You can pick the color. And what's interesting is you'll find that some words evoke more than one sense, and I'm going to talk more about those in a little bit. But go through and mark them with the colors, and then go back and look at the results. Because if there is some color that is lacking, maybe you want to start adding into your editing process a conscious pass where you're adding that. Or maybe you want to try incorporate it into your writing process and sort of deliberately invoke it. I have a friend whose writing advice in critiques is often make this smellier. And it is just often, sometimes when I'm writing, I'm like, well, I really want to pull the reader in. Well, what are the smells? And one of the things to remember about this is invoking the senses is more than having your characters step out onto the front porch and kind of, look out onto the evening and listen to the evening breeze and smell the, all of that. Description is filtered through your character's point of view. So you don't need to say that stuff is coming through their senses. So instead of he smelled the lilacs on the breeze, think about constructions like the smell of lilacs wafted on the breeze, or a breeze reached him carrying the smell of lilacs, or something like that. And that's going to be, it's just a little bit kind of more inside the body than that extra he smelled kind of pushes us out of the story just a little bit, if that makes sense. And notice I'm using a kind of motion stuff there, so it's a good way to describe things. So if you were doing exercises, the writing exercises that I have people do, one is to describe a moment when your character is entering an unfamiliar place, thinking about what they smell, taste, and particularly feel. And another is to go to the food store and get several foodstuffs you have never tried, bring them home, taste them, and then spend a few hundred words describing the taste and what it makes you think of and what you would compare it to. Really kind of do some solid description. Okay. So I said we would talk about those words that were more than one color, and now I'm going to. Some words have more than one sense built into them. And a good example of this are often adjectives that are based on foods, lemon, tangerine, mint, right, which all have color and taste and smell. Smell and taste are often mingled in a single word, and you can take advantage of that as well. You know, if you're doing smell words, you're probably doing some taste words and vice versa. Think also about texture that can be built into these words as well. A spaghetti tangle of tubes, something flaky as pie crust, steaming hot tea. All of those have a textural feeling as well as the taste and the aroma of the food stuff. And this is, for me, one of the reasons to explore new foods as well as learning how to make them. Because if you have a deeper knowledge of them, I think you can use them more meaningfully in your writing. And one of the things about the You Sexy Thing is they're a group of restaurateurs. So I get a chance to kind of talk about the cuisine and the weird food. And in fact, in the last book, my editor was like, I need more, lean more into the food stuff. And I just had a blast with it. Search for the words that have more than one sense contained in them and treasure them because they are useful. They are tiny little Swiss knives packed full of extra blades of meaning. So if you want to explore this with writing exercises, food is one of the very richest sources of sensory imagery, and it also evokes all sorts of emotions depending on your character. So I would take a particular place in your story and first write a few pages of description of it from the point of view of someone who is very hungry. And then I would follow up with a time writing of a similar length from the point of view of someone who has glutted themselves to the point of nausea. And let that stuff seep through into the description. Another exercise is to take a trip through a kitchen and go through sniffing the different sauces and spices. Think about the ones that are used in combination with each other, like cardamom, clove, cinnamon, pepper, ginger spices, to make chai. Or pumpkin spice, the infamous pumpkin spice. What are the smells of one of the kitchens of your childhood? And I would write a timed writing about that space and its smells. And finally, some words have motion as well as a pleasant sense of sound to them, like plop, ping, ping, puddle, splash, or tweak. And I would come up with a list of 5 or 6 of these, and then use a time writing trying to use as many of those as you can. Okay. And my third little sensory tool in this particular drawer of the writerly toolbox is those verbs. Verbs are one of the best places to invoke the senses in your writing, particularly things that have a sense of motion, to trot, swoosh, swipe, thrill. And they can, as I said, they can have a sense of auditory pleasure built into them as well. I think it's a great idea to make a habit of looking for strong verbs. And strong verbs will allow you to do a number of things in your writing, including one is avoiding passive voice, giving you a chance to substitute more dynamic verbs for kind of, was or were, is. And passive voice, one of the things about it is it stilts and slows prose. It removes a sense of motion from the prose. And so if you put those kind of more interesting motion-filled verbs in there, it will help move description along. This is, in fact, I think one of the really good ways to keep description from slowing a story's pace down is go through and make sure that there is some motion verbs that are giving it a sense of energy and urgency. Good verbs can create more precision in your writing by using verbs that accurately reflect what's happening. And a single strong verb can hold a wealth of meaning, including its sensory implications. And finally, the verb can give the reader information about the character's emotional connection to the details being disclosed. The sad throb of the nightingale's song, the nostalgic sweetness of cherry candy, the happy bob of balloons. Nobody who was sad ever described the bob of balloons as happy. Okay. If you wanted to do writing exercises, I would think of a highly sensory experience that you've enjoyed lately, a favorite meal or a bubble bath or walk through some garden, either in full bloom or snowy, and describe it on a couple of pages using no passive voice whatsoever. This is actually a really kind of fun exercise to try and use no passive voice at all. And I used to, it sometimes can be a challenge. Another exercise is take a few pages from your more recent piece of writing, go through, highlight instances of passive voice, and go through trying to put in a sensory verb for each of them, or preferably one that has some motion. And finally, pick a manual occupation or a hobby such as carpentry, gardening, cooking, medicine, bookbinding, whatever. But create a list of 10 verbs drawn from that occupation or hobby, and then use that list of verbs to describe a place unrelated to the occupation or hobby. And that can be a really interesting exercise. All right, so there's some tools that have to do with sensory stuff. And another way to create immersive worlds is to think about the blocking, thinking about where things are in space and how does your character move through and among them. And one of the tools that I use for blocking are maps. I think that maps can be an integral part of the writing process, particularly if the setting is a place that you're unfamiliar with. Maps can spawn story ideas, or they can make it easier to map out the action of a fight sequence. If you've seen The Princess Bride, and if you haven't, you should, but there's a wonderful fight scene between the masked swordsman and Inigo Montoya, and they go all over the place. They go up stairways and kind of swing around, and a sequence like that makes a space feel more real. It helps you create a more immersive world. If you use the same location several times over the course of a work or the course of several stories, you'll find that pieces of it begin to take on resonance, that it will become increasingly familiar in your head and it will begin to shape the story. And it's cool for your readers because your readers invest a certain amount of effort into envisioning places. And when they get to come back to that place that they've envisioned before, not only is it a little less effort, but they get to kind of amplify on it. They get to be like, oh yeah, there he is behind the bar. I remember that particular bottle of tequila or whatever, because the writer mentioned it. You don't have to draw these maps of things from scratch. It is perfectly valid to use examples from the real world, if you like, places that you know well, but don't be afraid to alter them where you need to in the service of the story. And this doesn't just hold true at the city or country level. If you have a scene that's taking place within a house, think of a similar house that you know well and map the action onto that. And again, don't be afraid to alter the details. So if you wanted to try this out with a couple of writing exercises, one is to write a scene set inside a place that you know well from childhood, but have always disliked. It should be a place that you know well enough that you could draw a relatively accurate map of it. Another exercise is to use the wonders of Google Earth. Google Earth will take you all over the world if you like. Use it to explore some place that you've never been and find a particular vantage point. And then write a scene from the point of view of someone who's stuck in that place and wants out of it. Another is to map a city and make up 3 landmarks in it. Then pick one and think about what sort of story might begin or end at that landmark and write the scene in which it appears. If you run role-playing games, this is one thing I do with my players, is I make them describe some of the landmarks of their home cities, and then we use that to kind of build the world together. All right. Another blocking tool is to have interactions with things and objects. If you want a world that feels richly detailed, have your character interact with it. Have them pick things up and put them down. Have them taste them or sniff them. Have them use them to defend themselves. Don't have your lazy ranger standing in the forest. Have her leaning against the nearest pine tree with her arms crossed. Along the same lines, your protagonist is a lens into the story that affects what the reader will see. So your point of view character will notice things. They will notice discrepancies, oddnesses, things that don't belong, and they will focus on the things that matter to them, things that are a potential goal or a possible hindrance to that goal. You always want to know what your character wants, right? As actors say, what's my motivation? So what is your character trying? What is their big goal? Because that's what they're going to look at things and think about. And that affects what they're going to notice. It's just a really useful thing. Show us this world in action rather than a sort of static, unmoving shot. Instead of there was a table, show us the papers cluttering it. Instead of there was a bridge, have your characters cross it or witness someone else crossing it. So if you wanted some exercises to explore interactions with objects with, one is to think of an object whose acquisition marked a transition stage in your character's life, and then write a scene in which they've lost that object and are trying to find it again. Another is to write a scene in which you show your character making or repairing something, maybe a meal, piece of clothing, or a bit of art, and you want to think about how they handle the tools they're using and how familiar or not they are with those tools. Where did they learn to do what they're doing, and what memories of that process come to them? And another set of objects are what's the character wearing? What are the pieces of clothing that your character are wearing, and who made them? Are they used or new, expensive or cheap? What is it about them that made your character pick them? Maybe they couldn't, maybe it was forced on them in some way. And one useful exercise to do to kind of explore this is write a scene in which your character is dressing before going to confront someone who has a great deal of power over them. With characters in this question of wardrobe, I don't want to know an exhaustive list of what the character's wearing, right? And I don't usually want to know the brand names, but I want to know things about the clothing, like, is it dirty? Did they just dig it out from under the bed that morning? Or is it so freshly pressed that there's unbroken pleats along the front? Are there still tags dangling from it? And one of the reasons you want to think about what your character's wearing is because we all assemble our styles for the world, at least to the point where we're able to. And how we choose to appear says something about the message that we want to send out. Along the same lines, objects have conditions. They're new or old, elaborate or simple, beautiful or not so beautiful. And their condition tells the reader something about their history, and particularly their history in relationship with their owner or the person that uses them the most. If you have a gunslinger who has revolvers that are meticulously cleaned and polished, that gunslinger has a different personality than their counterpart who just shoves those guns back in and doesn't worry about cleaning them, lets them get rained on and stuff. You can often use a single object or thing to stand in for the larger entity, right? The single member of the crowd whose face your character glimpses as they stoop to pick up a stone to throw. The one panicked horse leaping an obstacle in the chaos of the stampede. The single discarded napkin that signals a hasty end to one's dinner. So all of those are blocking tools. But this is one of the things I think where it is handy to daydream about your space. If you're stuck in your story, think about what the surroundings are and think about what are the objects, what are the situations. Okay. And my third set of tools are economics. And most of us go economics, and we're not fond of it because it wasn't very interesting class. Again, depending on personality in college, I liked economics. And one of the things that I think about when I'm world building is scarcity and abundance. What is scarce and what is abundant? Because particularly if you're writing a whole big fantasy world or a whole big planetary system or something like that, the answer to that question is going to shape so much about a society. It's going to shape its architecture, its government, its currencies, its laws, its fashions, maybe even the very hairstyles affected by its members. It's who is in charge of these things, who controls them, who controls the means of production, as Marx would say, who's disenfranchised by the system. And often the best stories, when you're thinking about things in these terms, will reside in the group for whom the system causes trouble. Because complaints and unhappiness make for much more engaging stories than the people who the system pleases. Think about the Hunger Games, told from the point of view of one of the upper crust. There probably would not be quite as interesting a narrative. So think about what is scarce and who does the scarcity most affect, and what lengths will they go to in order to address that issue. It's interesting to think about who performs public services and who does things like handle disposing of the dead or maintaining the sewer system, the transportation systems. What are the physical mechanisms and buildings of the government? What are the courts, the police stations, the licenses and taxes? Where does the wealth of the world get physically stored, and how does it manifest? All of this is worth a good, solid sitting down and thinking about it for a while. If you're doing a fantasy world, if you're doing something set in the real world, it's good to know those things, right? They're already pre-supplied for you. If you want to mess around with this and do some exercises, one is to pick a material like rubber, iron, coal, sand, silk, bamboo, bone, and think about what sort of technology might grow out of an abundance of it. And then write a scene in which your character is interacting with that technology. Think about what sort of foods are common and what is scarce, and write a description of a celebratory feast that features an elaborate and expensive dessert. And finally, think about what building materials are scarce in this world. Write a description of a house or a living quarter constructed of those materials in order to showcase the owner's wealth. I was in Spain for a month last year, and it's really interesting there because very few wooden houses. Everything's made out of stone, and it's because there's just not enough wood. Whereas here in America, and I presume so in Canada, we've got trees all over the place, and so we build wooden houses more than we build stone. Okay, so think about what is scarce, what is abundant, what is my character's access to those things. Think also about the trade flows. When you're thinking about what's abundant and what's scarce, think about how that differs geographically and how those things are moved from one place to another. Usually cities are based in places that allow for flow of trade because they're on a transportation route like a river or another body of water or some other central hub. An object's cost will be affected by where it comes from and how hard it is to get it from one place to another, and that's going to play into that scarcity and abundance. Centers of trade will be centers of wealth, and they'll be centers of learning. They will be places full of travelers and liminal spaces where those travelers are coming and going. The criminals of these areas will have special scams in order to prey on gullible or otherwise vulnerable travelers. And there may well be a counterbalancing force in the form of police or other authorities. Sometimes cities will try to track or control the flow of travelers in a particular manner. And no matter what place you're writing about, think about its relation to trade. Does it have easy access to luxuries, or are they extra special because they're so hard to come by? My godkid the other day asked why the oranges were really special in Laura Ingalls Wilder's big house in the Little Woods, or Little House in the Big Woods. And it was because, of course, oranges were a rare and scarce thing. So they got one in their Christmas stocking, and that was about it. How is life there shaped by such access or the lack of it? And what's your character's relationship and history with the economic flows around them? What are the state of their finances? And so when you're thinking about this, some exercises to try. One is to think about what is the main source of energy in your society. Is it cheap and plentiful, or is it hard to come by? How does its existence affect the level of technology and the speed at which that technology changes and develops? And I think write a scene in which a character is interacting with an energy source in some way. It would be an interesting exercise. Another thing to think about is, what is the currency system like? How are taxes handled, right? We're coming up on tax season for here in America. Who does or doesn't pay them? What are the attitudes towards wealth? And then write a scene in which a character is reckoning up their taxes the night before they're due. Might be an interesting one. And finally, think about, what are the ways that wealthy people show off? How do they dress, and what things do they do? And what cheaper versions of those things do the lower classes do? And write a scene in which a lower class person is assembling the outfit that will allow them to pass as upper class. I think would be an interesting one. Another economic tool is, as I said, your character's wallet. Know what your character's resources has, what they have to draw on, and particularly the financial ones. Because for one thing, one of the worst things you can, if you want to make your character's life more complicated, hit them right in the wallet by removing some of their money. There's plenty of ways to lose it. Maybe they gamble, maybe they're careless, maybe somebody robs them, maybe they spend things irrationally. And a character without money is usually has to find a way to try to get it. Maybe some form of employment, but there's plenty of other possibilities that can lead a plot in all sorts of directions. And I think it's interesting to think about your character and the key moments that affect their attitude towards money. It's interesting to think about them winning a major prize or inheriting something. What was it like when they earned their first paycheck? What was it like the first time they got cheated by somebody or cheated someone? First time they got stolen by. Scenes, if you want to experiment with this, write a scene in which you show your character spending or earning a substantial sum of money. What are their emotions about it? What would the money allow them to do? Another is to write a brief scene in which you show your character interacting with a job that they dislike, but which is necessary financially. You may want to think about whether it's a temporary situation or whether they don't see an end in sight. And finally, write a brief scene in which you show your character applying for a job that they want very much. How have they chosen their outfit? How have they groomed themselves? What lucky talismans or rituals might they employ? What's their body language like, and how do they physically feel? So these are all ways to create immersive worlds. And some things that people sometimes go astray with is thinking like, I'm going to use a lot of words to describe this because I'm going to try and get as much description in as possible, because that way I know I'll nail it, because somewhere in there will be the right word. And the answer is yes, the right word is in there somewhere. You need to pare things down. Often using the perfect word is going to serve you in better stead than using a whole mess of them. As the commercials used to say, less is more. And think about the details that your character would notice, the ones that matter to them, because that's part of character development. When you're world building, don't create monocultures. Your world should be diverse, not monolithic, unless there is some reason for it being the latter. Show how cultures have collided historically and how they've adapted to each other. And particularly when you're dealing with worlds where you've got different kinds of beings coexisting. Provide diverging and sometimes conflicting belief systems that create difficulties for your characters. I would also think about, when your society, which of its citizens are at a disadvantage because of its shapes and structures. I find societies with no class structure are either really unrealistic, or somebody's overlooking something, or it's a very boring utopia. But think about who lacks resources and how do they try to get access to them. And Anton Chekhov says, a kind of famous quote says, "Don't tell me the moon is shining, show me the glint of it on broken glass. Give us meaningful fragments that let us assemble a pleasing whole." Don't be afraid to generate random details in order to make your world more real or to counter your own biases. I play Dungeons and Dragons, so I use a 10-sided die to determine my character's gender when they don't come to me with part of that, already have part of that package. And the current schema for that is 1 to 3 female, 4 to 6 male, 7 to 10 something else, or kind of dealer's choice there. And I think that keeps me honest in a way that lets me overlook, we've all got cultural conditioning. I think that random phrases or explorations can sometimes yield all sorts of fruitful grace notes for a piece. And you can, one of the things I do when I'm looking to rewrite a piece is I go through and I look for the details that I can amplify. Stephen King talks about excavating the details of a story, which I love because it's like taking a little brush and brushing away all the dirt and letting the details that really should stand out. And it's fine to seed them in later on, give us a phrase spray painted on a wall that later turns out to be a secret revolutionary slogan, or a madman muttering on the street who's proclaiming how the invincible being can be overthrown. Because this can be a lot of fun to do, and B, this is the sort of thing that really makes a reader think you know what you're doing, which is what we do as writers. We try to convince people that we know what we're doing. I think this is why I think it is really useful to do those timed writings, because when you're doing them, you let place or people or event names bubble up onto the page without detailed explanations of how they came to be. And you can always go back and explain them in later stories. But the nice thing about, having mentioned these random things is that their existence helps imply a rich world beyond that which lies on the page. And this means what you're doing is you're making sure that you spend some time in the rewrite process going through and looking for the details that you can amplify and coaxing them out. And I think for me, this is really crucial, because in order to write, I have to not be thinking, I have to write a publishable piece. I have to have given myself permission to write crap. And I just think about it in terms of word count. I don't think about it in terms of X number of good words. And it's because I have learned to trust myself that I can make it good in the rewrite. I can always write a story, and it may be a horrible, awful, limping, broken-legged story, but I can fix it. I can make it better. And that is a good way for me to conquer the fear of the blank page, because you can't fix a blank page, but you can fix that weird, filthy, strange lump of words that you stuck on the page. So often, just start with a moment in your world, and just write. Describe what's going on and name things without worrying about providing context or making sure it's the perfect name or that it fits with your morphological scheme, because that stuff can get fixed later. Just write and let the details come without sorting or critiquing them. Okay. And kind of finally, one last thing in writing immersive worlds. Your senses are some of your best assets when you're gathering data to spin into a story. And don't be afraid to mess with them, by which I don't mean artificial substances so much as notice when they're awry. Notice when you're feverish or dizzy, or when you're too hot or too cold or thirsty or migraine ridden. Because that can all go into your writing. Close your eyes every once in a while and focus not on the outside world, but the sounds and sensations of your own body, grumbles of your abdomen, the beating of your heart, the tickle in your throat when you take a breath, the twinge of an eyelash caught in the corner of your eye, because those are moments of reality that would make a character notice them, feel very real, feel very much there. The poet Hart Crane reportedly used to drink an entire bottle of red wine and then stick his head in a Victrola's horn while it was played at loud volume in order to derange his senses and write better poetry. I don't think you need to go that far, but a little derangement may not be a bad thing every once in a while, particularly if you're writing fantasy and science fiction. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Kat. I thoroughly enjoyed hearing about your stories and your ideas with world building, and reflecting, as you were talking, on my own experience reading your books. I can definitely see how, like, you've incorporated the senses and food in particular, and the maps of the spaces, and even economics, all of these things in your book. So that was particularly interesting. And one thing, towards the end of your talk, you talked about how the existence of all that work that you've done really helps imply a rich world that beyond what's on the page. And I really like reading your books. I feel like you imply so many ideas in terms of like what you've thought about in terms of the world, but it's not all there. But as a reader, I knew that I trusted that you had that figured out, and it really is part of what pulled me along, was finding the joy of discovery in terms of finding out what's in the world, and what I'm going to learn about next. And yeah, that relates to a couple of questions that we got. People are asking. Tatiana, I think, was the first one to post this in the Q&A. How do you determine the right amount of world building to serve the story without dipping into too much exposition?
Well, part of that's going to depend on what kind of writer you are. And there are, this is kind of a continuum, but writers either kind of overwrite and trim back, or they write very little and then kind of fill it in the edit. The right level of detail is not so much I can't really kind of give you a formula like, 10% or something like that. But basically think of the level of detail as like a lens. And if you're not providing a lot of detail, the lens is zoomed out pretty far. It's how far do you want to go in? It's like a movie. Do you want to go in and lovingly examine, say, the soda can? Ooh, it's interesting. The soda can from every angle. Is that part of the narrative? It's going to slow the story down, but maybe. But you also want to think about it. You've got a set of dials as a writer that kind of go from fast to slow, and they are length. And it is length of word, length of sentence, length of paragraph, and then kind of length along those lines. And part of that is length of description. And the more description you have, the more it's going to slow things down. Do you want it slow? Sometimes you want slow stuff, right? Sometimes you want a kind of dreamy, lethargic pace. Most of the time you don't, but it's under your control, and those are your tools. Does that make sense? I hope.
I think that's a good way of thinking about it, because you're absolutely right. You don't always want the same pace in a story. The pace has to change.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So thinking about that in terms of just how you're going to change up the pace and how description is a useful tool for that is, I think that's a great way of thinking about that. We have a question about writing fantasy, and would you have to research for a fantasy novel, and how should that relate to reality? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, sure. It depends on. It depends partially on the fantasy, right?
Yeah.
If it's like Victorian alternate London, like Victorian London, but we've got fairies, I would spend a certain amount of researching Victorian London. If it is a completely made up world, I would at least spend some time thinking about it. And I have a very hard time writing in a world if it doesn't make sense to me. I got asked a number of years ago as a part of a shared world experiment. It was this giant tube that basically one end of it opened up on different realities every once in a while, and then there were all these civilizations that had grown up on the sides of the tube, and there was a thing that provided light and all this, and they were like, "Could you write one of these?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure." And then I got to it, and I was like, "This makes no sense to me, right? It just, the economics of it don't work. This just seems so implausible that it was a real effort to write that. It wasn't until I kind of managed to reconcile it in my head that I was able to. So just make sure you know the science of it. Although kind of caveat, if you are writing hard science fiction, like if you're writing for Analog or someplace like that, go through and fact check all that science and make sure, because otherwise readers will catch you on it and they will be displeased because that will throw them out of the story. That moment where they're going, no, a firewall is not a physical entity, is the moment where they remember their reading, right?
Mm-hmm. Having an idea of the reader expectations is important.
That is.
Yeah. And I think no matter how strange or invented the world is, there still has to be some relation to our world. Mm-hmm. Like what you were talking about with food, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
There's always a way one could incorporate research, I suppose. We have a question from Bob. How detailed is the world building before you start writing the story? And when you're writing, does the world change as you write the story?
Oh, it absolutely does. Because I'm a big pantser. When I wrote You Sexy Thing, I wrote very quickly, and all I did was I sat down. I knew that I wanted a group of people, ex-mercenaries running a restaurant, but I sat down and started writing, and suddenly two people were arguing about an eggplant. And I was like, okay, where does this go? And it was just, that's one for me. That's why I write, is because it's so much fun to find out what's going to happen.
I'm curious about your writing process. Do you just spend a lot of time exploring the world, like through the exercises you talked about?
I definitely use them, particularly when I'm stuck or having trouble with kind of envisioning something. Most of the time, I sit down. At least this is how I write nowadays. It used to be different. But I sit down and I write in consecutive order, or at least what I think is consecutive order, which may change in the edit. Mm-hmm. And I have an idea of what is going to happen in the first third of the book, kind of a rough idea, like things are going to explode. They're going to get off a spaceship or the space station. And then I write that and outline it. And then I use that outline to tell me what the second act is going to be like. Mm-hmm. And kind of, again, a kind of big, broad, okay, now they're going to go into the pirate haven and somehow they're going to escape. And then I write it. And then I do that again for the third. I think one of the important things, at least for me, in editing is remembering that outlines are just a great revision tool. So I don't write outlines out ahead of time, but I do write them afterwards.
Oh, interesting. And that's a way to help you make sense of what you've done.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and it guides me along. And the process is going to differ. Like my friend Django Wexler, who writes huge, immense, thick books, writes like I want to say like 25,000 word outline. And that may be an outrageous exaggeration, but it's really long. And I couldn't do that because then you've written and you found out all the fun stuff. Mm-hmm. So why would you write it?
Yeah, I'm on your side of things. If I have figured out everything, then I'm bored. So I can't imagine doing a 25,000 word outline, but that really does work for some people, I suppose.
Yeah. And that's I think one of the things to remember about writing advice is everybody's process is different. And the trick as a writer is to explore different ways of doing things and find the ones that work and do them. Yeah. If you can. I mean, I found when I wrote You Sexy Thing, I wrote it over the course of a month. And I was trying out this new technique, which involved getting up at 5:30 in the morning every day and going to the gym and working out and then avoiding the internet entirely until I got my word count. Mm-hmm. And it was great. But am I ever going to do that again? Probably not, because it involved getting up at 5:30 in the morning. And I like to sleep in. So
yeah, sleep is good. That's interesting. And that process, that worked, that your book got, that's a great book.
It was, and I wrote it to self-publish originally. I was like, I'm going to write a fun book of the kind of that I like to read. It's going to have found family. It's going to have banter. It's going to have food. Mm-hmm. And then I took it to my agent and was like, hey, dude, sign off on this. And he's like, nope. I was glad that he didn't, because he did sell it. So that was really cool.
That's great. I want to ask you a little bit about publishing. I read a lot of science fiction books, and at the end of the books, it seems like almost all the authors have been published in about the same 3 or 4 magazines, like Analog or Clark's World. Can you maybe provide a little bit of insight about that?
Well, there has always been sort of like one of the paths to publishing is to start by writing short stories and get some measure of success there, either by appearing on award ballots or gaining a name or in it somehow, mm-hmm. to the point where then when you pitch novels to publishers, they go, oh, yes. But it's not the only way. Yeah. A lot of people do go with a novel and don't publish short stories ahead of time. The nice thing about, and I write short stories because I love writing short stories. I would do it either way. It does help you get a bit of a name. It does get editors. It kind of gets editors aware of you, and it gives you something of an intro to the world of science fiction, which does have kind of like, there are conventions, there are ways to get to know editors. And I'm not saying get to know editors and then they buy everything from you, but there's ways to get to know editors and talk to them about what they're looking for, or, go to writing workshops at conventions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. It seems as though there are a lot of conventions in the science fiction and fantasy writing space.
Too many. Yeah. I could go to one every single weekend, and they take up time. Mm-hmm. I will be at a writers conference in Bremerton, Washington this year. Oh. And I know I'm going to be at another one. Oh, Gen Con. I'm going to be at Gen Con. But other than that, I don't think I'm going to be at much stuff because I have writing to do.
You mentioned possibly self-publishing You Sexy Thing. Do you have any thoughts or advice for people who are interested in self-publishing? Yeah, two things is, if you're going to self-publish, one is, remember that self-publishing means that you have to then be the editor and the cover designer and all of that, and most importantly, the marketer. Mm-hmm. And that's a pain in the ass, and like the social media person and all of that. The other thing is that if you're going to succeed in self-publishing, and I have a number of friends that have, you have to be one of those people that writes fast and writes consistently and thinks about the market and gets stuff out.
If you look for the Amazon author Tasha Black, Tasha Black is a friend of mine, a husband-wife team, and I play in the husband's D&D game. But they know how to do it. But if you look at it, you'll see they have published just so many books. It's because they're a team; they can write that fast.
Oh wow, yeah. There's a question about having help from an editor. Someone asked about whether you use a structural editor. Do you? And can you talk about like the editing process in general, especially in terms of help from others?
Well, I don't. So I don't. With my short stories, I don't use an outside editor. I do some developmental editing for people, where basically I'll kind of go through and help them figure out what they want to do with the story. But I don't do that. But with novels, I'm very lucky to have an amazing editor at Tor, Jen Gunnels. Shout out to Jen. But she is the person who really kind of gives me the structural help with the novel that I need. Mm-hmm. And it ends up being a better novel for that.
Yeah. What type of advice does she give?
Well, I like one thing in the last book was she said, I'm not seeing enough food. And I was like, okay, I absolutely need to have more food. And she pointed out some places where I had moved scenes around. And so the chronology was out of order. And I would have never noticed that in 1,000 years because I'm too close to the book. And, suggested some things as far as maybe this character should do a particular thing. And I was like, oh, yes, absolutely. And so great stuff.
Really thinking deeply about your work and how to get it to the next stage. It kind of seems like what you're talking about there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That's a gift to find someone who can do that.
It is. It is. And I suggest to people that you get critique groups of your fellows that are writing stories or whatever, and get a chance to get feedback, because that's really handy.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question. We have a question. Should you turn to familiar places when writing about an imagined place, which is the usual case in science fiction?
I think it's very handy too. I think it is very useful too, but I think an alternative to that is to spend a certain amount of time daydreaming in that space. Or I have used a space that I first created for a Dungeons and Dragons game, because I put a certain amount of time into thinking about it.
Just spending the time to make it real, as though you have been there.
And it is okay you can use the internet and Google around and find details. Just make sure they're the right ones.
All right. That's great. And thank you so much for all the wonderful thoughts and advice. I encourage people to visit your website, catrambo.com. I know you have a lot of resources for writers, so it seems very much worth checking out. And I definitely recommend reading Kat's book, You Sexy Thing. It's a lot of fun. I found it very comforting and engaging, and the world building really was quite exceptional. So thank you again, Kat. Is there anything else you want to leave the audience with today?
Well, I will mention, if people want to find out more about my classes in school, I'm going to drop the link in chat. We just did last year our first face-to-face workshop, and we rented a castle in Spain and spent 3 weeks there. And we're planning this next year's, which is going to be in the U.S.
Yeah,
in an undisclosed location.
That's great. Yeah, so check that out, everybody. And thank you again, everybody, for being here. If you have any thoughts or questions for me, you can always email support@authorspublish.com. I want to thank everybody behind the scenes, Caitlin Jans, Emily Harstone, S. Calikar, who make these possible. And I want to thank all of the supporters who have helped with the lecture series over the years. So thank you again, everybody. And thank you, Kat. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.
Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Take care. Bye-bye.